You should have stayed away. This story creeps up on you, subtly worming its way into your thoughts before wrapping you in a thick fog of dread. It taps into the primal fear of being utterly alone, where the things around you seem familiar but just wrong. There's a constant sense of anticipation, an itch in the back of your mind that something awful is lurking, something you can't quite put your finger on. And through it all, silence becomes its own character, amplifying every creak, every shift, every shadow. This story isn't about jump scares or grotesque monsters. It's about the unraveling of a mind in isolation, where the lines between reality and nightmare blur until there's nothing left but fear. Mark had never been fond of the old family cabin, but when his mother died, he felt an odd pull to visit. It was the only place that still held echoes of her voice, her laughter. The cabin had been left untouched for years, frozen in time, and yet it seemed to call him. He thought it would be a peaceful place to breathe, to find solace away from the suffocating condolences of well-meaning friends. What he found, however, was something far darker. From the moment Mark stepped inside, a heavy sense of isolation draped over him like a leaden weight. The air felt thick, the silence pressing against his skin. Dust covered the furniture, and the smell of damp would mixed with something metallic hung in the air. Everything was just as he remembered, almost. The wallpaper looked a shade darker. The hallway seemed longer, and there was a draft where there shouldn't be one. But what unsettled him most was the bedroom. It was his mother's old room. He avoided going in there, afraid of the memories it would dredge up. Yet every night, he heard faint sounds coming from inside, a low creak, a shuffle, sometimes a whisper. Mark convinced himself it was just the cabin settling, or maybe the wind playing tricks on his tired mind. But deep down, he knew something was off. One night, after hours of listening to the sounds from the bedroom, Mark finally worked up the courage to check. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for him. His hand shook as he pushed it open. The room was as it had always been. His mother's belongings were still there, untouched. The bed was neatly made, the window closed. And yet, that feeling of wrongness gnawed at him. Something was missing, or perhaps something had been added. As Mark stood there, staring into the dimly lit room, a wave of nausea washed over him. A sudden, overwhelming sense of loss gripped him. He missed her so much it hurt. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring his vision. But then he noticed something, the wardrobe door. It was open, just a crack, though he distinctly remembered shutting it earlier. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. His mind raced, but his feet wouldn't move. He stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence stretched out, thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. Suddenly, there was a soft thud from inside the wardrobe. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end. He knew he should leave, run far away from that room. But something, some unseen force, kept him rooted to the spot. He reached for the wardrobe door, his hand trembling. As he pulled it open, the musty smell hit him first, followed by the sight of his mother's old clothes, neatly hung, just as they had been when she was alive. But something shifted in the shadows at the back of the wardrobe. His heart raced as he leaned in, squinting into the darkness. And then in the corner, he saw it, a figure huddled, almost hidden. It was small, childlike, and it rocked back and forth, muttering under its breath. Mark stumbled back, his mind reeling. He hadn't come to the cabin alone. Something had been waiting for him, something that had been there for years. He felt the icy grip of helplessness tighten around his chest. He wanted to believe it wasn't real, that his grief was making him see things, but the whispers were real. They weren't in his head. The figure in the wardrobe was real. Over the next few days, Mark's grip on reality began to unravel. He avoided the bedroom, but no matter where he went in the cabin, he felt watched. At night, he could hear the figure's whispers, even when the wardrobe was closed. It grew louder, closer, as though it was slowly escaping its confines. Mark barely slept, barely ate, consumed by the thought that he wasn't alone. He began to notice other things too, subtle changes in the cabin. The furniture seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. The pictures on the walls, family photos, appeared different. His mother's face looked wrong. her eyes darker, her smile too wide, too forced. Sometimes he could swear the eyes followed him as he moved through the cabin. Mark started hearing other noises at night. Soft footsteps pacing the hallway, the sound of something dragging across the floor. He'd bolt out of bed, heart racing, only to find nothing. The silence that followed was worse than the sounds themselves, as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting. Before we continue to the climax, we want to hear your scary stories. Drop them in the comments, and we'll pick some to read in our next video. And if you've been enjoying the eerie background music that's been setting the tone for this story, just comment #StoryDiveMusic below, and we'll send it to you for free. Whether it's a haunting tale or that chilling track you can't get out of your head, we've got you covered. Then came the dream. In it, Mark stood in his mother's bedroom, but the air was thick with decay, and the figure from the wardrobe was standing at the foot of the bed. Only now, it was no longer huddled. It was standing tall, its face obscured in shadow, but its eyes glowed with a malevolent light. Mark tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stretched its hand toward him, and as it touched his chest, Mark felt his heart stop. He woke up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, but the fear didn't leave him. In the days that followed, Mark became consumed by the feeling that his mother had been trying to warn him about something. But it was too late. Whatever was in the cabin had already gotten inside him. The isolation, the constant presence of something just out of sight, drove him to the brink of madness. On the final night, Mark woke to a cold breeze. The wardrobe door was wide open, and the figure was standing at the foot of his bed. This time, it wasn't whispering. It stood silent, staring. Mark couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The fear was so thick it choked him. And then, the figure spoke in his mother's voice. "You should have stayed away." The words echoed in the stillness, and in that moment, Mark knew this was never his mother's cabin. It had always belonged to something else. The next morning, when Mark's brother arrived to check on him, the cabin was eerily silent. Mark was nowhere to be found. The only sign he had ever been there was his shoes, neatly placed by the front door, and a note scratched into the wall in what looked like blood.